Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Magdi Hanna with IIST and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, User Acceptance Testing in Agile Environment by Philip Liu. We're excited that you are able to join us today and take an hour of your time to attend this webinar. This webinar is sponsored by IIST, the leader in education-based certification and training. For more information about how IIST can help you and your organization, please visit testinginstitute.com. This webinar is one of a series of webinars offered by IIST. Be sure to join us in the next webinar in the series, Gaining Control of the Product and the Process Quality with Integrated ALM, on October 26th from 11 to 12 Central Time. To learn more about this webinar and the other webinars, please visit testinginstitute.com. During this webinar, you may submit any question using the Questions tab on your GoToWebinar window. The presenter will try to answer as many questions within the time allowed. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available within 48 hours at testinginstitute.com. At the end of the 2 days webinar, you will be asked to complete a short survey. We hope that you take a few minutes to fill out this survey. Now I will turn the webinar to today's speaker, Phil Liu. Phil?
Hi, Magni. Great to be here with you and be able to spend some time with your following. Just a quick word about XPOsoft. I'm the CEO of XPOsoft, and this is what we do. We're a testing services company, but it's really not about XPOsoft today. I'd like to talk a little bit just for some house rules. I think the most important thing here I've put in green, and that is that I'd like you guys, the attendees, to ask questions and participate. And if you don't, I will ask you questions. So I'm hoping that we can really get a interactive session here rather than me just being talking to myself. The last thing there, if you look at the webinar hashtag, if you want to tweet on Twitter, stuff that tidbits of information that you gather today, feel free to use that hashtag. And we'll just move on. So here we go. Just a little about me. I think I introduced myself already. One thing that I've traveled to over 60 countries, and I really enjoy traveling and getting a different view on things. And I'd like to consider myself agile. So that's actually part of the talk today in terms of agile versus the development methodology versus agile, the adjective. And the reason that I thought about this this topic was that I was talking to some colleagues about testing, traditional acceptance testing, and how there's, we have these end users that have these needs or these customers that have needs, and somehow we have all of these dotted lines and curvy lines getting somehow to business needs where they're documented by business analysts and marketing folks, and then finally it gets to the person that's going to pay for the stuff, and that would be the sponsor, or and then finally it gets to the people that are making the stuff, and then it gets to being an actual product. In that long chain, there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of uncertainty. And so the reason for that, I believe, is that because the end user is not really involved as much as they should be or even used to be. So I'm going to be talking about that today in terms of what I say, putting the user back into user acceptance testing. I guess I should have done that. Yeah, so anyways, lots of dotted lines and lots of indirectness, not as much directness as we'd like to have. And so the problem with traditional UAT, if you think about it, used to happen at the end of the cycle, right? And Magdi and I had a discussion about this just a minute ago, where at the end it's just too late, especially with Agile. You have a very limited period of time, and a lot of times in the past you may recruit users to do some testing at the end, And what we've found, what I've found in my experience, is that they may not be interested really in doing testing anyway. They're dragged into a room. They're not testers. They own from an accounting package, for example, and you recruit in a accounts payable clerk to take a look at the software. They're only going to be testing from their own small point of view. Same thing with an accounts receivable clerk and so on. And a CEO or CIO may look at the reporting and dashboards, but in terms of looking at the software from an overall point of view and a flow point of view, very few people, very few testers, quote unquote, that are recruited into user acceptance testing will really test the whole software as a whole. And so today's going to be about what I call putting the user back into user acceptance testing and putting acceptance back into testing in an agile context and in an agile way. So you notice that agile context, agile is capitalized because that mentions the reference to the Agile Manifesto, whereas agile way is not capitalized because that's an adjective. And I think sometimes we forget that agile should be based on agile. So, I think that one of the things that I've thought about a lot recently in reading books and so on is, when you think about agile testing, where is the testing? Well, they say that we're all supposed to do testing. Everybody's responsible for quality. But in my mind, when everybody's responsible, then no one is responsible. And so we have to build the responsibility into the process and into our minds. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, not just from the user point of view, but from the whole team point of view. And I was in a webinar a few days ago and with Jason Arbon from Test.ai. We were talking about testing versus verification. And I think that in Agile, because we don't have a lot of time, we end up doing a lot of verifying, meaning that we're just checking to see if it works the way that it should work. And we're not really doing deep level testing. And so I'd like to, bring this up as a differentiation between testing and verification, because I think it's important when we think about the user stories and tasks underneath our user stories, the detailed level of our tasks, or what I call criteria and acceptance tests that are needed past verification. And so, I think about, what are the books that you're reading in Agile testing talking about? And by the way, I do color code this. So when I have green up here, I'm hoping that you type in questions and contribute on the question panel. Where is testing in Agile? What do people talk about testing? I think that, we've seen the inverted pyramid and where automation fits and so on. And automation, you need more to have more on the left side in terms of unit testing and so forth being automated. Who is doing the accepting? And I think what we find is that the developers or possibly the product owner, depending on if they have enough time, could be doing the accepting. Who is doing the testing? I mentioned before, everybody's responsible for quality, which means that nobody is responsible for quality. And then, who is checking and verifying versus who is really doing testing. So if you can take a few minutes and tell me on the question panel, I'll be listening in on what you think, where's your focus been in the last several years in terms of Agile quote unquote testing. And if you think you've been doing more verifying than testing, I'd like to hear from you. So let's look at Agile. Here's some stuff from the Agile Manifesto. And so we have individuals and interactions. I won't read the whole thing, but what you see here is that there's no mention of quality and no mention of testing. And I think when I look deeply at the Agile Manifesto, and I see this, I'm thinking to myself, okay, so that means it's really up to us to fit in quality and to fit in testing somewhere. And that's why there's been books written about it, because there's just nothing, there's principles here, but no real guidance. So I have this, I remember that commercial a few years ago. I'm probably dating myself. That's probably, I think this is from the 80s when Wendy's had that commercial on where's the beef, right? So where's the quality? So, think about it in terms of, I went to the principles of the Agile Manifesto and I grabbed out some stuff in here. And we have what? Satisfy the customer, valuable software, changing requirements, face-to-face conversation. There's no mention of quality still, and no mention of testing. We have excellence, that's a good word. Valuable, that's a good word. Satisfy the customer. Those are all good phrases, but there's no mention that we need to have quality in order to get there. And when I think about the Agile methodology and the Agile Manifesto, and I think about Agile versus Agile, we're all trying to go fast in Agile. And when you think about Usain Bolt, he's really fast, right? But is he agile? I don't really know the answer to that, but I would ascertain that there's a difference between being fast and being agile. And so I invite you to think about that. Are you sacrificing agility for speed? Are you equating speed with agility? And they're two different things. Right? Fast does not mean agile. And I invite you to think about that a little bit in terms of speed, trying to go fast, and change your meaning of agile, actually. So, it gets me to thinking about Agile with the stuff that we just looked at in terms of the principles. Agile is really just a set of principles. It's a set of ingredients that you could use when you're putting together a dish, the dish being your process in Agile development and rolling out a piece of software. It doesn't specify exactly, and so that's up to us to define. It doesn't say salt, it says seasoning, right? So I think we need to think a lot more deeply. And looking at those Agile testing books and the Agile Manifesto, it's really up to us to create from scratch. And one of the things that it said in the Agile Manifesto is changing requirements. And that's what I'd like to focus on today in terms of user acceptance testing. And based on all the clients that I've talked to and so forth, there seems to be a little bit of confusion and in terms of the nomenclature that's used for requirements. So requirements in a waterfall environment, we used to think of a big, thick book that we poured over and had spent a lot of time writing. And that was what Agile was born out of, was that, hey, we're going to have changing requirements, so we shouldn't spend so much time writing down requirements because they're going to change. And so we ended up having what we call user stories. And user stories had acceptance criteria, or they should have acceptance criteria. And so requirements in Agile is really a combination of these two things, user stories and acceptance criteria. And I think that's where we've lost a little bit of focus. There's never enough time, so to speak, for user stories and developing the level of detail that's needed, even though, and we use the excuse that, oh, they're changing, so we can't write too much detail, and we can't write too much on acceptance criteria. And I think that's really what I'd like to focus on today, is thinking about the level of detail and the stuff that's needed inside our user stories and what follows from that in terms of acceptance criteria. Some people call them tasks, right, underneath a user story. So these user stories, tasks, acceptance criteria, acceptance tests, those are really the bulk of what's called requirements in the Agile Manifesto. And I think that's how we really bring the user back into Agile, is through our user stories and really focusing on these. So, we forget that in doing all of our talking and our co-location and so on, and having all these collaboration tools amongst ourselves, business analysts and so forth, that we forget that it's really the user, the end user, the customer, that is going to be using our software and will decide if what we built is the right thing. And so what we like to do is really get customers involved in, not at the end, not in the traditional acceptance testing UAT, but really using them to help us develop tasks or acceptance criteria in terms of part of our user stories. And the second thing I'd like to emphasize is that the acceptance criteria and tests are not just created by the product owner or the quality person, but anybody that can really represent the voice of the customer should really be part of developing the user stories. So that's what I call putting the user into acceptance testing. So, we don't have a lot of time at the end of each iteration, as you know, to get the user involved on a personal basis, but we can get them involved in putting together and spending more time on the user stories and the criteria. And that's really what I'd like you to think about. And so this next slide here kind of gets to the implementation of quote unquote requirements. I've got a couple quotes there from some colleagues. Requirements are what you're building, and acceptance helps you measure what you built. Requirements should be coupled with acceptance tests. And so I'd like to bring up that nomenclature issue, that requirements are really user stories. Requirements are user stories with acceptance criteria and acceptance tests. So there's a little bit of a misuse of the word requirements, because requirements really needs to be the user stories coupled with these two things behind that. And so a user story, in order to become true, needs acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria really need to let you know, yes or no, true or false, that the user story came true. And I won't play the song, but when I thought about that in terms of coming true, it made me think of a song written back in the late 50s by Conway Twitty, and I'm probably dating myself, but he had a song that was called "It's Only Make Believe," and it was really a great song, really easy to sing to. But unless you have your user stories come true through acceptance criteria and acceptance tests, they're really only make believe. So this kind of shows a little flow in terms of really making your user stories come true through acceptance criteria and acceptance tests. And it shows a little circle there showing what requirements are. Requirements are the combination of user stories and acceptance criteria, changing your requirements from fake to real. So here's a little example of user stories, and I'm sure that all of you have experience in developing user stories. I just want to put a good example here in terms of an objective, a specific user, what they want to achieve, and how they're going to be using the application. And it's important to recognize, and I've said this already, but I want to say it again because it's really important, that user stories cannot be standalone. They have to be accompanied by good acceptance criteria with acceptance tests. So here's another example where I have that if I'm creating user accounts as an admin to a system, and then this is the acceptance criteria that go with that. And so who can tell me I'd like you guys the attendees, to kind of chime in here. What else should be in the acceptance criteria? And I'll give you 60 seconds of pause here while I take a sip of coffee, and let me know what else you think would be part of good acceptance criteria. So Magni, what do we have there? Are you guys all there?
Okay, I just unmuted myself. Well, the feedback is coming very quick. So Lydia says need to know that the user can gain access. I don't know if you can make sense out of that. Alan says restrict access for an administrator user. Lorraine said exclusions, anything that the system should not do. I like that, by the way, because
That's a great one.
Lorraine, I'm a very advocate of what I call shall not do behavior.
Okay, well, that's good.
Karen says confirm the user can actually log in. Jeff says security would be another. What should happen? My apology, by the way, because as you are typing your questions or your feedback, it scrolls down quick.
Okay.
Should happen if I am not an administrator? What should happen if I'm not an administrator? Rahman says specifying roles, if any.
Right.
Brenda says input criteria, brands impacted, location, and so on.
Okay, good. So I think it's important to note here that each of these criteria can be converted to a test with a yes or no answer. And I think that's really important to understand, that the level of granularity of the criteria needs to be converted to a yes or no answer. And you'll see that each of these ones here should be answered yes or no. So when you're developing your criteria, or tasks, people call them, they can easily be converted into a test of yes or no. And oops. And Lorraine said about what else you brought up many comments about what else should not be able to be done. And that's important too, right? First, what can't be done. And so those also should be converted into criteria that have a yes or no answer. Here are some other definitions of criteria from some of these so-called experts, right? Microsoft and Google. I don't know who they are, but they have their own acceptance criteria. They're not as granular as what we have, but we can use them only as guidelines. Here's some areas that criteria should cover. Not only functions, but non-functional criteria we should have as well. So it's important to think about, one of the attendees mentioned security. So that is also one of the non-functional criteria in addition to performance that needs to be specified for user acceptance. I think a lot of us tend to focus on functional criteria, but there's many other things that we could specify for criteria and that would have a yes or no answer. Here's another.
If Phil allows me to ask a question, since
you brought
up Since you brought up the concept of security and the other non-functional requirements, we all know that user stories by nature and by definition are all functional. How do we get to speak about security and performance and other things in the context of user stories? Would you suggest that we phrase this as some sort of a user story, or should we phrase those differently from the way? Because again, as you know, the format of a user story, that's normally as a role, I want to be able to do this. It kind of forces us to functionality. How do you suggest that we phrase certain non-functional needs?
Okay, well, that's good part here. Let's go back to this this here, right? So I said as an administrator, so as a user, right, I want to be able to, if you wanted to change it into a performance related criteria, I want to be able to access a certain menu, access the reports menu. I want to be able to print a report within 2 seconds so that I can, I don't know what that was, so that I can, but you get the idea. So you need to really specify. If we go back to the performance, here's one here, measured as response time in terms of a threshold. So I want to be able to do this within a certain period or time frame, or if you want to convert that into a security criteria, what would that be? I as a hacker want to be able to go up against a wall that prevents me from accessing such and such a system if I'm a such and such a role, right? So put yourself, a user, a hacker is also a user, and not a welcome user, but they could be a user, and so you could actually put a user story in terms of being a hacker. Does that kind of clarify it a little bit, Magdi?
Yes. So you are of the opinion that even non-functional objectives or non-functional rules or non-functional requirements should be still phrased in the form of a user story, even if we have to tweak it a little bit.
You can convert it, right?
Okay, good. Thank you.
Because if you don't convert it into something that really means something from an end user point of view, then it's just a bunch of numbers.
Okay, understood.
Yeah. Okay. This gets back to what I had mentioned before in terms of having a clear yes or no answer. And I think the third bullet point there, as far as defining the boundaries and parameters of a user story, this really helps you to define the user story at the level of granularity that's appropriate. So one of the things, as you know, in Agile is, we don't have requirements, we have user stories, but the user stories still need to be defined at the level of granularity where you can have, like I said, acceptance criteria with yes or no answers. And that really helps it helps the developers to understand what they're doing, and it helps people that are testing the software to understand what they're testing and what they're looking for as whether or not the criteria has passed. What is acceptable, not acceptable, should be easily translated into one or more test cases. Actually, that's a misnomer. I should have put one test case. So each criteria should translate into one test case. This is another important concept in terms of stating the intent, but not the solution. And I give some examples here. A manager can approve or disapprove an audit form. A manager can click on approve/disapprove radio button to approve an audit form. So we don't want to be so specific that we specify the implementation of the feature. So that's an important thing. Leaving the implementation and platform independent from the function. More stuff on what I have, good acceptance tests. You know, people used to say best practices, and then they say, oh, there's no best practices. So I just say good. Um, Reusable. You know, a lot of times we think of automation and we say, okay, well, you know, in Agile, we're moving to the left, so we need to do a lot of white box testing, static code, automate, and unit tests, automation. And then there's a lot of schools that say, oh, yeah, we don't need to do any black box automation and UI automation because that's all changing. But we can also have API automation. And so that's one of the things that we're working on a lot these days in terms of doing calls and getting back information that is appropriate for those calls. And you can automate that as well. And that's usually fairly static and can be automated in terms of what you should be getting back from the software. Here's a quote from a colleague of mine. We don't have automated acceptance tests, which would be nice. And at one time they're working towards that, but it was deprioritized by management. And you know, to me, I can't see why that would be something that would not be a priority in terms of automating acceptance tests. Possibly it was, you know, maybe they considered it all black box testing, and that's why they thought that acceptance tests should not be automated. But if you think of acceptance tests at all levels, and you think of that in inverted pyramid in a lot of the Agile testing books where you should be automating, it's not only on the left-hand side in terms of white box and unit tests, but also API testing, and you should still have some UI acceptance tests as well. Let's talk a little bit about the bigger picture and implementing Agile requirements. And so, you know, Agile requirements, I've talked about this before in terms of difference between the Agile Manifesto and the quote-unquote Agile methodology versus the Agile, the adjective. And I think that we require agility. Agility is the verb form of the adjective Agile. And if you look at what I've seen happen in the past is that if you don't, you know, in Agile, we talk about being co-located. And the problem is that if you are co-located, it works great. But the real situation is that we're not all co-located. And so then we have to adapt. And so what happens is sometimes we use these tools, whether they be online like Jira or even in many other collaboration tools or even plain old email. And so you have these updates and then people don't know about it for 48 hours or so because we're spread all over and we're not reading our emails or we're not checking Jira, we're just doing our own thing. And so we have to think about that and strike a balance between always being on our mobile phone or always being on our computer checking emails and checking collaboration systems versus getting our work done. And so that's the drawback of not being co-located, is that you have to do that. But I think it's something that could be put into a communications protocol or expectation for teams that are separated, because you really require, that's part of agility, right? Getting information and pivoting on that information. And if a feature, if a requirement, user story, and a task are changed in the documentation or the online system, it's really important for folks to get onto that right away and make the changes. Otherwise, you get to a week later and you say, oh, that was changed. So I think that's an important thing for people to think about in terms of separated Agile teams. So we need Agile people, right? So I said earlier that Usain Bolt, I didn't really think that maybe he's Agile, maybe he's not. Maybe he can just run straight ahead fast and can't run sideways fast or change directions very quickly. Those are much different skills. And so I think that having multiple people involved in reviewing and refining stories is really, really important. And this actually gets back to having an agile team and everybody being responsible for quality, so to speak. Everybody should really be contributing to and reviewing the user stories, not just from the sense of, oh, this is what I have to do, but really thinking about, is this really represent the user? Agile requirements. I think this is important when you think about backlogs and acceptance tests and acceptance criteria. We need to really only think outward a few weeks at a time. I say 2 to 3 sprints, so a month at a time really in advance. And the reason for that is that I know for myself that it's, and I think for other folks too, maybe it's just because I'm old, I don't know, but it's harder for me to remember too much out about a month. So I think it's important to, and also if you end up doing a lot of specs, ahead of time, then, oh, we need to change it. So I think it's important to really stick to your guns in terms of having these detail. So we're doing more detail. I'm talking about doing more detail in our user stories and our acceptance criteria. But we're only doing that detail in terms of our immediate tasks at hand. And in terms of implementing it, I think that it's important to think about 2 fixed points. The fixed points are the quality and the timeline, right? So we want to have good quality and we want to stick to our timeline. And so the flexible things are what we include. And I think that's important to remember in terms of our user stories and what we include in each iteration. Here's kind of a highlight of that. I'd like to emphasize a few things here. We all know that the quote unquote, the team defines the acceptance criteria to exit the sprint. I think that's pretty well known. So the next question is, and there's a blank there, it says, blank ties the acceptance test to the criteria. So I think it's important for, when you think about this, is for when you look at the criteria, can they be tied to an acceptance test? And what is the level of granularity of that criteria? Is it at the right level in order to make it into an acceptance test? The next blank is acceptance testing is done by blank. And so who is the acceptance testing done by? And sometimes that leads to acceptable by who. And I think the word acceptable by who is really important. That leads on to the next slide, is that a lot of times we do this demo, or we're supposed to do a demo and retro at the end of the iteration, and the product owner is not as involved as we'd like them to be involved. And so this brings up, who's doing the accepting. So I think that the product owner, a lot of times, and teams that I've worked on, they're not as involved as they should be. But I think it's their job to really put the user back into user acceptance testing. So one thing is they must show up, right? They should be in all the meetings. They must be clear on the criteria, and they must be clear on acceptance tests tied to the criteria. But I think that the important thing here is that they need to pull others. It's their job to enroll others in looking at the user stories and the criteria that represent the end user and customer into the conversation. And so you notice there in green here, who could the product owner pull into the conversation? And I'll give you 60 seconds to think about that a little bit while I take another sip of coffee. I think this is an important concept to think about, because the product owner, shoot, they're busy, right? And yet they're supposed to represent the end user and customer, but no one's perfect, and they might not even have all the information in their head, or maybe they forgot. And it's important for them to enroll others in the conversation. So I'd like you to take 60 seconds, and Magni, if you can unmute yourself in a few seconds and let me know as the questions comments roll in, that would be
Sure,
fantastic.
sure. I am ready when you are. Ready when you are.
So what do we have here? I mean,
All right.
I'm curious what
Here
people
are some
say.
answers. I'm going to read them very quick again because they're scrolling in front of me very quick. People who
Okay.
handle support. People who handle support. Account managers and CSRs. They should pull in the actual person who works with the with this day to day. So actual users. Subject matter experts, i.e. testers who have been on project for a long time. Testers who have been in project for a long time are not subject matter experts, are they? Not necessarily. Okay. This kind of question, can QA execute and determine pass fail of acceptance tests? I'll leave this question until the end, but let's continue.
I think,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
you had just a really good point there that someone brought up, and I find this, I do this a lot with our clients, is that the customer service reps, the technical support, those people need to be brought into the conversation about the user stories. And why is because they're the front line to the customer. They're answering all the customer's questions. Oh, I can't figure this out, or how do I do this, and so on. And so they need to be part of the conversation in terms of what goes into the product, because they know what the customers ask. And that's something that often gets left out in terms of them being a good voice for the customer or for the end user.
Here is a more ambitious view by Jeff. He says, customer support, tech support, account manager, sales, engineers. I don't know if you could do all that, Jeff, but I'll leave it up to.
Well, I think that recruiting them into the user stories, there's a lot of ways to do that, right? You can use, I've used survey tools to get more people involved and having them help, and it's the way that you use those tools and to implement them and get them involved, and because their time is limited too, but they have valuable input into the user stories. So I think that's important.
Okay. A lot of people here are focusing on salespeople. The assumption here is that we're talking about a commercial product that's being sold outside.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely. I mean, sometimes we're developing this product and we forget people have to go out and sell it, and they certainly would represent the end user as well. So that's really good. So we have sales, account managers, which is also part of sales, as well as the customer and tech support. Yeah, a lot of times we end up developing these stories, I would say in a vacuum almost, because we think we know, but sometimes we don't.
I will just share this last one from Kathy because it's a kind of very interesting practice. Kathy says we also use to have testing parties over lunch, and lunch is provided to invite someone from each department, including billing and receptionists, to run through scripts. All right, that's kind of interesting, and they found things that others did not. So to get those admins and non-technical people to run through the scripts, that's very interesting experience. I don't know. And Kathy seems to report a good experience with that.
You could have a user story luncheon or something like that. Yeah, that sounds good. Or maybe you could make it fun and call it something about storytelling. Wow, that's really good input. Thanks, Magdi. Yep. I think we're running up on 45 minutes here. So I think what we've talked about today, I'm hoping that it was helpful for you in terms of really thinking about Agile requirements and what they are, what is considered a good story, and what is considered a good acceptance criteria, and really getting the user involved in terms of not making your dreams come true, but making your stories come true, and bringing the what I call the user back into user acceptance testing. And I hope that you've thought about a little bit more depth of how we can all do that together to make our software convert it from, or make the equivalence of working as coded to working as intended. And the things that you can think about in transforming your agile process. The first thing is really putting the user back into acceptance testing, getting users, and we just talked about this, involved in developing and reviewing stories and criteria, and clearly defining the product orders role, as that's really a primary role in terms of getting the user involved and representing the user. That's one of the reasons that Agile was developed in the first place, was that not only do we have changing requirements, but we want to have the user's voice. That's very important. The second point I'd like people to take away is putting the acceptance back into acceptance testing through a focus on the criteria and yes, no, pass or fail type of criteria that are granular at the right level. And the third point is thinking about testing versus verification, and not only making sure that it works, but really trying to break it and do things that one of the attendees brought up in terms of what it should not do is very, very important, as well as bringing in the other non-functional aspects that we briefly discussed as well. So I think that's it for today, Magdi, and unless there's more questions that came in, I'm here for as long as you like.
Well, I've been keeping an eye on some questions that you might want to answer. Jen asks, she says, it is a really challenge to get customers involved in the testing. Are there any suggestions that you have regarding how to do this?
Well, I don't think it's, yeah, that's a good point. So I think it's hard to get users involved in testing. And if you get users involved in testing, we end up with the traditional problems with user acceptance testing, which I mentioned in the beginning. But I don't think it's that hard to get them involved in flushing out and verifying user stories. So what I've done in the past is used tools like SurveyMonkey or Google Forms to really get input from them, asking questions about user stories and asking questions about functionality or even performance. What performance is acceptable to you, and giving them easy ways to answer it with multiple choice. And that actually can go into your user stories and go into your own criteria, because I don't think we really want them to do the testing, but we want them to have really good input into the story and the criteria.
All right.
Anything else coming in?
Just there is another experience from Kathy here, which I think it's interesting. Kathy is the same person who also talked about the lunch thing. She said we don't do UAT, but we rather do validation. We create a document that walks the user in business through the changes or the bug fixes for them to validate. Again, a new thing to me. So, and then we have full automated testing as well manual testing. But yeah, the concept of validation of the fixes and the changes through a document that's shared with the business users, that's what I find interesting. It's not really a question.
Yeah, I mean, I think documents are good. The problem is nobody has time to read. What I like to do is I like to develop these very easy to answer questionnaires with the multiple choice, yes, no, and so on. If you phrase your questions carefully, you can get criteria and input out of those answers.
All right. I don't see other questions. There's a lot of redundant questions. So, and I'm
Okay.
very impressed, by the way, with the level of interaction from the attendees. Thank you so much for that. Your interaction makes the webinar more successful, though. I have a question here that just came from Renee. Can you suggest any resources for writing good acceptance criteria?
Actually, I don't have any in my back pocket. I have a list of books that I use, and I can send a link on a blog to you guys, to you, Magdi, and you can broadcast it out to your audience.
Okay. If I have to be a little bit selfish here, and I hope it's not self-promoting, Renee, I've been always speaking about the difference between acceptance criteria versus scenarios, and I teach both and I practice both. I'm going to suggest that listen to any one of the free webinars that I have posted at the testinginstitute.com about scenarios, in my opinion, and I could be wrong and I could be biased. In my opinion, when I write scenarios, when people write scenarios the way I explain them, they can come up with a much better elaboration of the user stories than what they would do using acceptance criteria. Again, it's my position that at least, again, scenarios, the way I practice them and I ask people to practice them, are much more elaborate. And every time I had Agile people in my class who have practiced acceptance criteria, they looked at the scenarios and I said, would you take those scenarios to replace your acceptance criteria? They said, no, we'll leave acceptance criteria because it's much higher level. We will also do scenarios in addition. So I have actually a recent free webinar available. I believe it's called Acceptance Criteria versus Scenarios. That's the title. Listen to this one at the testinginstitute.com website, and maybe you'll get a better idea about how to use the concept of scenarios to come up with better acceptance criteria. I don't care if you call them scenarios or not, but I think the technique, the method by which I write scenarios is very powerful in terms of elaborating all what you care, whether they are scenarios or acceptance criteria. All what you care really is to come up with lots of details, a lot of the specifics about the behavior. And I think, again, scenarios help me do this far better than acceptance criteria. But again, I don't know if this answers your question, Renee. Sorry to take the stage for myself, Phil. I know.
No problem. I think we're set if no questions have come in. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to your audience, Magdi, and I hope I get invited back again.
Thank you so much, Phil, for your time. It's a pleasure to have you. I've always learned from you. Anytime you speak, I've learned a lot myself today from you. Thanks so much for giving the time. Thanks to everyone for taking the time to listen and join us in this webinar. Please, again, don't forget to join us in the next webinar on gaining control of product and the process quality with integrated ALM on October 26th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Again, thank you so much. Make sure that you follow IICT on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you, Magdi.
This webinar is being recorded and will be posted at Testing Institute website by early next week.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.